Thanks very much for coming along this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Asia Scotland Institute, our home here at the ECCI. Most of you, I imagine, are familiar with the Institute and its general mission of promoting links between Scotland and countries across Asia in areas covering all of business and politics, society, education, culture and the arts. And part of that involves bringing to Scotland speakers who can provide some expert insight into various issues affecting countries across the region. So we're delighted this evening to welcome Steve Buckley as our speaker this evening. Steve has very considerable experience of Asia, having spent around 20 years working for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and UK Trade and Investment at a range of posts, including Seoul, Kuala Lumpur, Beijing, and latterly Bangkok, where he served as the Director for Trade and Investment. Since 2010, he's been Asia Pacific advisor to the OCS Group, which I believe is one of the UK's largest facilities management companies,
privately owned,
with operations across the Middle East and through to Asia, which takes Steve to the region frequently. He's also, I believe, the chairman of the UK group of the British Chamber of Commerce in Thailand.
In Thailand, yeah.
And retains strong links with the business community there and elsewhere in the region. So Steve is going to speak to us for a little while, and then afterwards there'll be some time for question and answer, and then after that there'll be a glass of wine just outside where we had tea and coffee, so please stay around for a chat after that. In the meantime, we'll get started.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And let me begin by actually thanking you all for coming along this evening. I mean, it's just so shortly after the Easter holiday, so yeah, it's good to see you here. And I must admit, the invitation that I got from the chairman, Roddy Gow, he asked me probably about 6 months or so ago, would I mind speaking to the Institute? And I'm very happy. I mean, he's very proactive and he's done very well. So I'm more than happy to come up and do this. But it sort of gave me an opportunity to sit down and just reflect on the part that Asia's played in my life. I mean, not only just from a career perspective, but also from a personal point of view. And I'll focus mainly on my professional life, but just go back and give you my first Asian experience actually took place over 50 years ago when my father, who is also a member of the diplomatic service, he was posted to Singapore. And in those days, very different to what they are today, travelling by ship was the norm. And it was firstly from my perspective, it was sort of with some trepidation that we went to Liverpool and we boarded a ship. And that was the start of a 3-week journey to Singapore, where we went through the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, Aden, Colombo and Penang. And I then spent the next 2.5 years in Singapore, relatively young, at Grace's kindergarten, which probably doesn't exist anymore. And a lot of my free time was at the Singapore Swimming Club. Now, at the time, that was located on the coast. And not only on the coast, we used to have a lot of relics from the Second World War. The bunkers are all along the coastline as well. Now, I mention that because if you go to Singapore today, the Singapore Swimming Club is still there, but it's a mile inshore. And it's just one indication of just how much Singapore has changed and how much land has been reclaimed. But after a most enjoyable return, 3-week sea journey back, and something which actually this time I was a little bit older and I appreciated a little more, it wasn't until the late 60s that I went back to Asia when my father, this time, was posted to what was at the time East Pakistan, is now Bangladesh. And I used to visit my parents during the school holidays. And Bangladesh, or East Pakistan as it was then, was very different from Singapore. I don't know if any of you have been to Bangladesh, but Bangladesh is as flat as a pancake. There's no stone in the ground at all the construction materials were imported from India. There's an enormous amount of water around, and Bangladesh is prone to regular natural disasters. And it's also one of the poorest countries in the world. So a very different environment and these days that hasn't moved on to the same extent as Singapore. But nonetheless, my trips were very interesting. Going to Dhaka, we used to have to stop off in Karachi, going and coming back. We went up to some lovely tea gardens in Sylhet and visited beaches in Chittagong and Cox's Bazar. Very, very interesting from my perspective. But with that overseas travel sort of already in my blood. I joined the Foreign Office or Foreign Commonwealth Office in 1972. And my early career involved several stints in London, where I mainly worked in the personnel, HR areas, something which many of my colleagues were very envious of, because there was a belief that if you worked in HR, you could fix your own postings. And I won't say whether there's any truth in that or not, but it didn't stop me from staying in that field. And I went overseas. My first overseas posting was to Jordan. A very interesting posting from my perspective, because my father had already been to Jordan. So I'd been there as a schoolboy, and a number of the staff who were working at the embassy when I went there had also been there when I was a schoolboy. So that was actually very interesting. I then went to Australia. I went to Canberra. It was a very popular move from a personal point of view, because my wife is a New Zealander. So she was delighted to be going to Australia, where we could go to New Zealand on a regular basis. And I also went to Dakar, not Bangladesh, but Dakar in Senegal in West Africa, before my next opportunity to go back to Asia came my way in 1987. This was my very first commercial posting on the trade and investment side to Seoul. And I soon discovered that South Korea is known as the Hermit Kingdom. And if anyone's been to Korea and they know Korea, then they'll understand why it's called the Hermit Kingdom. The time I went there, the country and the people were very inward looking. Very few people could travel out of the country unless you were in the military or a senior civil servant or a senior businessman. You couldn't get a passport. And as a result, English certainly wasn't widely spoken. It certainly wasn't widely understood. Few of the workers there took more than a few days holiday a year. And companies, chaebols, which are the main corporates in Korea, Hyundai, Daewoo, LG, Samsung, at the time I was there, they were spending more money on entertainment than they were on research and development. And you can just see how things have changed today with the companies. But things were very different in those days. It was also an extremely interesting time on the political front. Seoul had hosted the Asian Games as a dress rehearsal for the 1988 Olympics, so they weren't taking any chances. I mean, they'd actually done that, and they wanted to have the Olympics in a shorter period than Japan had had it. This was one of the great rivalries between the Japanese and the Koreans. But in the lead up to the Games, the government, they unilaterally appointed a new general to become the Prime Minister, someone who was not very popular. And this sparked off a series of demonstrations, and these became increasingly more violent. And really, because there was a fear or a major concern that if these demonstrations continued, that the Korean government may lose the right to host the Games. So the government backed down, and that wasn't something that happened very often. But that actually proved a catalyst for Korea to open up after the Games. And it was something that we in the embassy and the commercial section, we could take advantage of. Seoul was the place at the time where you had to be going to Seoul. You didn't pass through it. You didn't transit as if you were going to Hong Kong or somewhere like that. Seoul was the end of the road. So to get businessmen to come, we would be looking to see which trade missions were going to Taiwan, to Tokyo or to Hong Kong. And we built up our trade mission program till, I think, in one particular action-packed year, we actually had 25 trade missions to Seoul. And UK exports, and one of the things we launched in particular was Scotch whisky. We did that from scratch, became one of our biggest exports to South Korea. And the 5 years that I was in Seoul is not just down to me by any means, but our exports to Korea went from 300 million to 900 million in those 5 years. That gives you an indication of how successful it was. But I left Seoul in May 2002. I came back to London. I took up another personnel role. This time I headed a section in the Foreign Office looking after the operation and staffing requirements of all our posts in Africa and the Middle East and the Gulf. It was a very challenging role, interesting, but even so, I was very pleased when in 1996 I got the opportunity to go to Kuala Lumpur as our Deputy Director of Trade. Things got off to a good start. There's plenty of solid business prospects. Malaysia's a great place to be based. And everything was going well until the Asian downturn came along in 1997. Started in Thailand, but quickly spread throughout the region. And it changed everything overnight. From Malaysia's perspective, unlike Thailand, they had considerable oil reserves, and that enabled Dr. Mahathir, who was the Prime Minister at the time, to impose a fixed ringgit US dollar exchange rate, and that helped cushion the blow as far as Malaysia was concerned. Within the embassy, or the High Commission as it was in Malaysia, much of my time was spent promoting one of Dr. Mahathir's main projects. He'd honed in on the idea that the multimedia super corridor, as he called it, this was a vehicle which he was going to use to deliver mature, developed market status for Malaysia by 2020. Started off with a launch in Silicon Valley in the States, and the second launch which I was very much involved in, was to the UK, and we did a very big launch in London at Imperial College. Another project I was involved in at the time was putting a new British-Malaysian Institute in place. This followed on from the Germans who were there before us, the German-Malaysian Institute, and also the Malaysian-French Institute. But these were vocational training institutes, which in our case was a greenfield site, which the Malaysians financed, building the institute for 1,000 students. It gives you some idea of the scale. And I had a lot of support from British companies such as British Airways, British Aerospace, HSBC, Rolls-Royce, Standard Chartered, and we set up this establishment primarily focused on the automotive vocational training side, which also came into being with Malaysia bringing Formula One to Malaysia. And I actually can remember I had some very good contacts in the Sauber Petronas team, and I remember having a meeting with Bernie Eccleston at Silverstone, trying to persuade him that this would be a good thing for him to get involved in and to sponsor. He told me that he was very supportive, but he said that his partner, Mr. Mosley, was the man with the money and not him, and suggested that I meet up with Mr. Mosley the next day. And he gave me a paddock pass to come back, which was very generous of him. The next day, fog descended. I never got to meet Mr. Mosley, and I never got any money out of Formula One from my institute. But it was still all the same. It was still very, very interesting. And in addition, and this is in common with everybody else who was in the High Commission, I was kept busy with the preparations for Her Majesty the Queen's visit to KL. She was invited to open and close the Commonwealth Games in 1998. And my involvement was, I had two engagements for the Queen. One was to visit the old British-Malaysian Institute, which she went around, and also to open up, we had an exhibition site which we'd put in the centre of KL, rather close to where the Petronas Towers are now. We had a UK at KLCC exhibition. It was a tented village in many respects. We had a number of British companies who were exhibiting there. It was always all done very well. The only sad thing was that within minutes of the Queen arriving, there was a power cut. And we were all standing a bit like this evening in suits and waiting to greet her. And then we had to take the Queen around the exhibition. She never complained at all. And the whole trip around, she was superb. And I also had one event in the Duke of Edinburgh's programme. I did a visit out to the Multimedia Super Corridor project, and I must say, of those particular engagements, the two that I arranged for the Queen, and I don't know anyone who's had the pleasure of looking after the Queen, her programme is arranged on a minute-by-minute basis, so she knows what happens the first minute she walks into the engagement till we're at the 30th minute when she leaves. She knows every minute what she's going to be doing. The Duke of Edinburgh does as well, but he doesn't quite follow the script as closely as the Queen. So I was far happier looking after the Queen than I was the Duke of Edinburgh. And again, on the political side, there was some serious issues that cropped up. Dr. Mahathir fell out with his heir apparent, Anwar Ibrahim. And this happened as the Queen had just arrived in KL. And very unlike Malaysia. Malaysia has a very strong middle class. You seldom see demonstrations on the street, but this particular issue brought demonstrators onto the street. And at one stage, questions were seriously being asked about whether the Queen's visit should just be called off. Fortunately, things quietened down and everything passed off without incident. And it was a very, very good visit. And it was also linked to Manchester taking over the game, so we were able to pass things over to Manchester very well. But in May 2000, I moved to Beijing to head the 30-strong commercial section there. Caroline, who's sitting at the back now, was a member of the team when I was there. I didn't know that she was going to be here, but it's good to see her again. But this proved really the start of a very fascinating 5 years, which actually saw China, which had already shown signs of doing, but transforming itself into a major economic force. My main interest on the sectorial side was the natural resources sector. I also spent a lot of time in the northeast of China, in Liaoning province, Shenyang, which is the provincial capital, where I arranged the inaugural Shenyang British Trade Fair, which attracted 80 British companies. And we also, as it happened, had a visit by Stockport County at the same time, which sort of added a bit of flavour to the fair. And in the time I was there, in the 5 years I was there, I visited most of the other 21 provinces wherever I went. I also went to most of the major municipalities: Beijing, Chongqing, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Tianjin. And the thing that impressed me probably the most was the priority which the central government had given to improving the infrastructure in China. Every province had a new airport, ports where they were applicable, railways, these were all upgraded. Highways were built which crisscrossed China. You could drive from the east to the west, north and south. And really, it gave China the platform to actually get its logistics off the ground. It gave enormous priority, and that paid off. And a country that I now spend a lot of my time, India, in comparison, hasn't followed that route. And I think it's something that they really need to replicate sooner than later, because this is what's actually one of the main reasons of holding them back. But I thoroughly enjoyed my time in China. It pays dividends when you learn how the system worked, how you could put it to good use for UK PLC. And in this regard, one had a sort of inbuilt advantage of being a diplomat. The Chinese are sticklers for protocol. They're very keen to make sure that they know where you fit into the status, into the pecking order, and they make sure that you're seen by the right people. And part and parcel of that is actually building up an influential network of contacts. Something which unlike Caroline, I'm not a Mandarin speaker, but it's very, very important to sort of have face-to-face contact in China and not rely on your local Chinese staff to do all the contacts for you, because although that's a very easy way of doing it, you'll never really get to know the key people yourself. But on the commercial front, one of the biggest initiatives I was involved in was it followed this decision by the central government to, in their energy package, predominantly made up of coal, 65%, oil was about 25%, but natural gas was only 2.5%. And they took a decision that they were going to, by 2020, they were going to quadruple the use of natural gas. So we set up what became to be known as the China-UK Natural Gas Working Group. And the key to the success of this was, again, people who know China, there's a government organisation called the National Development Reform Commission, the NDRC. Relatively small by Chinese standards, but incredibly powerful. It oversees China's economy, and the people who work for it are very capable, but hugely influential. And they became our partners for the China-UK Natural Gas Group. And that particular initiative, conservatively, I would say, realised somewhere in the region of £300 to £400 million of business for our companies like BP, Rolls-Royce, and Shell. I can remember with Rolls-Royce, for example, where I was back in the UK with a Chinese delegation, and we were looking after them in London, and they wanted to go and see the London Eye. So we had the whole delegation in one of the pods, and I brought in the Rolls-Royce guys, and for the next hour and a half, they couldn't do anything but talk about this particular contract, which was worth 175 million pounds for Rolls-Royce. And without that trip to the Eye, I think probably we may not have actually got it. But other things more generally which stick in the mind of my time in Beijing, there was only 2 occasions where I saw large numbers of citizens spontaneously coming on the streets. You just don't see this in China. The 2 occasions, one was when Beijing was awarded the 2008 Olympics, it's in 2004, and also when China qualified for the World Cup. They had a similar reaction. They were ecstatic. I don't know if many of you remember there was the severe acute respiratory syndrome epidemic, SARS, as it was well known. Well, that outbreak first started in Guangdong in November 2002. Didn't really have a huge impact in Beijing until April 2003, when the number of confirmed cases of SARS in Beijing suddenly went from 37 to 400 in a matter of days. I mean, they had been seriously unreporting these cases and trying to play down the whole thing, but it got to a point where it was just getting out of hand. They couldn't do this anymore. And for the first time, there was a sort of sense of panic came into Beijing. The central district area, where our embassy, the embassy diplomatic area, one of them was located, which wasn't far away from this, very quickly became a ghost town. I mean, you hardly saw anybody on the streets. Most people were staying at home, working at home. Many of the hotels, the restaurants, gyms were closed. And to imagine a city like Beijing, or certainly the central business district, becoming a ghost town was quite very strange. And the central government reacted by sacking the health minister. He was the second health minister while there'd been SARS, but they sacked him. And they brought in a lady called Wu Yi, who's the most senior Chinese lady in the central government structure. She took over as the Minister of Health, and one of her first actions was to actually introduce quarantine centres. So anybody who had symptoms of SARS were quarantined, and this hadn't been happening. And they were keeping records of the people who were there, where they'd got the symptoms from. And one of the things that we were very successful in doing was introducing a foreigners' quarantine ward, because if you showed signs of having a headache or a little bit of fever and they thought it was SARS, and you ended up in a Chinese SARS ward, you would never get out. I mean, because once you're in there. So we managed to persuade the Chinese to have a separate foreigners' ward. I think while I was there was only one foreigner who died in the whole time that I was there. And I think by having this separate ward probably saved a lot of our, and not just British people, but foreigners from actually dying as a result of SARS. But as a result of this quarantine policy, things fairly quickly got a sense of normality came back in. The number of cases stabilised, dropped, and things started getting back to normal. But it was only really bringing Wu Yi in that made a huge difference. It was also rather strange being in Beijing at the time, because I mean, while living in something of a ghost town, nobody wanted to see you. I mean, nobody in the UK wanted you there because they thought you might bring SARS over. Nobody in China wanted you. What was very, very interesting was the fact that SARS started in Guangzhou. Beijing was probably the hardest hit city, yet Shanghai didn't have a single case of SARS. And this sort of led to speculation that why did this happen? Well, what was quite interesting was the 16th National Congress took place in Beijing while this was going on, and there was one view was that perhaps because the powers that be wanted to take over and become the new Politburo, that they were quite prepared to bring up delegates from Guangdong to Beijing, and okay, there might be a few casualties, but at least they got power. And that was seen as one of the possible reasons of why SARS came to Beijing, because it's quite a distance, and the fact that Shanghai didn't get a single case was very interesting. Another happening while I was in Beijing, and this was not directly related to my time in China, but I paid a visit to North Korea. I went with a colleague, not a colleague, but a business person from the National Wool Textile Export Corporation. I went to spend 4 days in Pyongyang to look at the North Korean textile industry. We had an embassy there at the time, so it wasn't difficult for me to get a visa, to get entry. My friend, the NWTC, as it was known, had actually hosted a visit to Bradford by a senior member of the North Korean Small and Medium Industries Corporation. So he had no problem getting in, and we had no problem getting access and being shown around interesting places in North Korea. And we weren't made to sort of put up with all the normal protocol that you would have when you arrive in North Korea. I won't tell you all about the visit. There were some very interesting aspects to it, but one particular visit was we were allowed to drive down to the demilitarized zone. Quite a reasonable drive, probably 3 or 4 hour drive from Pyongyang. Not that there was much traffic on the road. We barely saw hardly any cars at all, and we went through probably a dozen military checkpoints on the way down. But when you get down towards the DMZ on the North Korean side, there is a hut there where the armistice was signed. And because we were there as the guests of the North Korean government, they briefed us on how this had taken place. And they told us about all the American generals had come in on bended knee, begging for surrender, and they were quite serious about it. I mean, there wasn't any humour applied. And then they took us to, on the DMZ itself, there's only one place, there is a hut on the DMZ where you can cross into the other side. And you have to book it. If you're on the North Korean side, you can book it from a certain time, similarly on the South Korean side. And you can actually walk across the line onto the other side of the hut. And we were flanked by probably a dozen North Korean guards who took us down to this hut, taken in there, allowed to walk around. That was fine. What was very interesting was on the windows on the other side of the hut were the American troops and the South Korean troops. And they didn't know who we were. And I guarantee you, if looks could have killed, we wouldn't have survived very long. They did not like the fact that we were there with the North Koreans, and I don't know what their intelligence told them. They were found out who we are, but it was a very interesting experience. But I went on from at the end of my tour in Beijing. I was expecting to go back to London, but I was fortunate enough to actually get the job of Director of Trade and Investment in Bangkok, and I went there in September 2005. And Thailand was a country I knew very well. I'd been holidaying there for many years. And one of the first tasks that I had on my remit was not on the trade side. It was actually preparing for the first anniversary of the Indian Ocean tsunami, which had taken place the previous Boxing Day in 2004. And interestingly enough, I have a timeshare in Phuket, and we were actually in Phuket up to the week before the tsunami happened. So we missed it. But part of the first anniversary preparations was to go down and see the main sites where British citizens had perished. Over 50 British people at least died in the tsunami. And we went down to places like Khao Lak, which is just on the mainland off Phuket, Phuket itself on several of the main beaches, Phi Phi Island. And this was a year after the tsunami, and going around looking at the sites was actually a pretty harrowing experience. I mean, Khao Lak had something like 120 different hotels and guest houses before the tsunami. Afterwards, it had 10. And you'd go around a particular area and someone would say, well, this used to be the hotel so-and-so, and you couldn't see anything at all. And they'd say, well, if you look very carefully, you'll see the outline of where the swimming pool was, and they'd show you this. And you'd see some of the debris which hadn't been cleaned up. You'd see people's, their luggage, their clothing, and such like. And it really brought it home. I mean, I wasn't there during the tsunami, but it was a very good way of sort of mentally preparing yourself for when the relatives came over for this first anniversary. It was a very interesting experience. On the commercial front, I mean, one of the main things about Thailand is that business succeeds despite politics, and it's very much the same today, actually, but it's been the case for a long time. It's a beautiful, welcoming country. It's visited by nearly 1 million British people every year. Give you some sort of scale. More British people visit Thailand than they do India. And about 50,000 British people live there, permanently or temporarily. It's got twice the landmass of the UK, similar sized population. But one of the main problems about Thailand is the distribution of wealth. Probably, this is a generalization, but in the region of 60 to 65% of the wealth is in the hands of about 100 or so families. And of the rest of the wealth, the royal family control at least 10% of it. So whether it's 70% or 75%, it doesn't take a mathematician to work out that the rest of the 65 million people in Thailand have about 25% of the wealth to go around. And what this creates is a situation of haves, mainly well-educated, reasonably well-off, middle class, upper class, Bangkok-based people who in Thailand are known as the yellow shirts, and the have-nots. And these are typically working class people. They're the farmers, they're the taxi drivers, they're fishermen. They make up what's called the red shirts. And this causes considerable social tension. And over the years, because there's considerably more have-nots than haves, every time there's an election, and I say in recent years been dominated by a family called the Shinawatra family, Thaksin Shinawatra and his younger sister, Yingluck, come out on top because there's more of them. You have a democratic election, and Thaksin himself and his younger sister Yingluck, the last 3 elections have all had overall majorities, which is very unusual in Thailand. Most of the elections tend to be coalitions, but they've won the elections on the last 3 times. And associated with that situation is a succession of military coups. So since going back to 1932, which is probably the first military coup, there's been 20 coups in Thailand, 12 of which have been successful. And the last of those took place in May last year. So it wasn't, and Thailand is still under military rule as we speak. Now, most of these are bloodless. They provide short-term stability. And if you were to go to Bangkok today, I'm going to go to Bangkok on Friday, but you will not notice anything different. I mean, it's just as if everything's back to normal. The problem is while you have the military in control, military dictatorships, if you could call it that, or military coups are not very popular. But what it does lead to is Thailand being largely alienated by the international community. There's no exchange of ministerial visits. There's very little government-to-government high-level contacts. But against that background, setting that in place, business has actually done remarkably well. And if I give you some examples of that, I mean, the British Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Thailand, the BCCT, which I mentioned, I'm the chairman, it's a rather glorified title, the chairman of the BCCT UK group, where if any members have any interests or any problems or any issues in the UK, they would come through me and I would try and help sort it out for them. They have in the region of 600 members, and many of the large or the leading UK corporates are there. The sort of the BA, the BG, BP, Boots, Diageo, HSBC, Rolls-Royce, Shell, Standard Chartered, Tesco. In fact, Thailand for Tesco is its largest international market. There's over 1,500 Tesco stores in Thailand. It's Boots' biggest international market. They've got close on to 300 stores. Many of Boots' stores are at the airports. They're aimed at the tourists who go in and forget to buy their suntan or something, and they'll go to the nearest Boots and get that. And during my time there, and to the best of my knowledge since, none of those companies have shown any inclination of wanting to leave the market. And this isn't a commercial for the company I work for, OCS Group at the moment, but a good example is the OCS Group. They first went to Thailand. It was its first international venture 25 years ago. They acquired an interest in a relatively small business then. It was called PCS, Pest Control Services. We still use PCS, but It has a pest control angle, but it's more of a property support company. And that little business over the 25 years has grown. It's now our regional headquarters. We employ 27,000 people in Thailand. We have 15 regional offices, and it's one of our strongest regional performers. Although now being pushed hard by our fast-growing Indian operation, where probably I spend much more time in India than I do in Thailand. But how did I come to be working for the OCS Group on secondment from the Foreign Office? Well, as I mentioned, having 20 of the last 25 years of my time in the office, the Foreign Office, was in Asia. I wanted to stay in Asia. The Foreign Office pointed out that I'd done pretty well for myself, and perhaps it's time I spend a bit more time in London. Not something I could argue against, but I floated the idea of why not? Could I go on a secondment to the private sector? Those 20 years I'd spent had all been spent on helping British companies, and it'd be quite nice to work on the other side of the fence. The Foreign Office were very supportive. They said, yes, that's fine. You find the secondment, and we'll finesse the paperwork for you. So I spoke to a wide range of companies, energy companies, banks, retail companies, many of the ones that I've mentioned there, and was offered several positions, but mainly relatively short term, 6 months, a year, where I was looking for something a bit longer. And OCS offered me a 3-year secondment, which later became a 5-year secondment because of the Indian factor. And I started with OCS on the 1st of December 2010. And I was given the title Asia Pacific Advisor. I still keep that title. And my role is, it's very much on a business development side. I have a place on our Indian board. I sit on our Asian board. But probably the biggest part of my role is on the strategic side in looking after what we call our key accounts, our biggest clients. In the UK, and I'm not so much involved on the UK side, but we turn over in the UK about £500 million a year, but our top 150 accounts account for 60% of that, which perhaps gives you an indication of how important these are. What I do in our international markets is look at our top 10 clients in each market, and the key thing is to make sure that we retain those clients, that we know them better. And whenever I go on any of my visits, I'll make a point of calling on some of those, making sure the ones that are coming up for renewal, that we're actually in good shape. And that's proved a large part of my role. But Asia per se, I think it's important to sort of highlight from OCS Group's point of view, it has become a major driving force in the company. I mean, we are a family-owned business, still family-owned business since 1900 in the UK. Started with one man as a window cleaner in Croydon in 1900, the New World Cleaning Company it was called. And today we have about 95,000 people working for us, almost turning over £1 billion. We're just shy of £1 billion. We hope we'll go through that barrier fairly soon. But of those 95,000 people, 65,000 work in Asia. Asia now brings in twice as much profit as the UK. So I think it's clear to say that Asia is where our future is going to be with the group. We're not going to leave the UK, but the UK, from a facilities services point of view, it's a very mature market. There's lots of competition here. Margins are continuously squeezed. I think if we just stayed in the UK, I don't think we would be in business for too much longer. And that's, for a company that's been around for 115 years, is a rather sad thing to have to say. But Asia, to us, has been seen as where we need to be, where we've established a large presence. We're in everywhere in Southeast Asia except for Myanmar, the Philippines and Indonesia, which we're looking at. We have a presence in Australia, New Zealand. We're the largest British employer in New Zealand. We have a relatively small business in China, about 1,000 people. And we've also now started to stray into the Middle East and the Gulf. We've got a presence in Doha, the UAE, and we're waiting for the paperwork to be done on Saudi. But of our markets there, and I say the reason why I spend so much time in India is, and why, in fact, I extended my secondment, was that the group took an active decision. I wasn't part of this process, but they took an active decision whether to expand their business in China or whether to do it in India. The group opted for India. They thought it was a easier market to do business in, which I can assure it's not. It's a very challenging place. English widely spoken, which they thought was a big plus, and the legal system. They also thought that was going to be very helpful. So we decided 3 years ago that we would expand our business in India, which up to that point had been there about 8 years. We had a joint venture with a company called PCI, Pest Control India. It's the largest pest control company in India, very successful business. But we had a very small business called PCI Environmental Services. We had about 1,000 people working on the housekeeping side. And our partner, who's now a non-exec member of our Indian board, Anil Rao, was quite happy just to keep the PCI side of the business. And we bought into 3 companies. We bought into another housekeeping company called Radiant, a light engineering hard service company called AFM, and a security personnel company called CISS. And those 3 companies, together with another company we have called Canon Hygiene, which provides, it's a global brand, provides feminine hygiene and washroom equipment. Those businesses gave us a workforce of 25,000 people in India. So we're now one of the 5 largest British employers in India. And from a group perspective, family business probably represents our largest investment in any market to date. And as a result, over the last 3 years, I've probably visited visited India 6 times a year, and continuing. I'm going to Thailand on Friday, but I'll be in India, Delhi and Mumbai shortly afterwards, and spending a lot of time in India because the group wants to see a return on its investment in India. But that's probably me speaking a lot. I mean, I've spoken about my career, the importance of Asia to our group in particular, but that reflects to many other companies too. So it's probably a good time for me to sort of stop and really throw the floor open to people to ask questions about anything that I've said or any ground that I've covered, or perhaps any points that I haven't touched upon. So I hope you found some of that of interest. Perhaps it demonstrates, certainly to me, I mean, when I put all that down, that Asia's become a major part of my life, and it's where I am now. I would not be in this particular role if I hadn't had that experience with the Foreign Office. But I think looking at that, probably getting on for half of my life has been spent in Asia, and it's only when you realise that, looking at it, how important something like this can become, and it sort of turns you in after a while in something of you get regarded as a sort of Asian expert. Well, it certainly served me well, and hopefully it'll serve me well for a bit longer. But thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Steve. That was fascinating. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to offer?
And you obviously know Southeast Asia very well. I think the Brits are pretty well regarded in Southeast Asia, and I know that there's a lot of trade being done, but what I've noticed with Scotland in particular is that we're underrepresented when it comes to the UK as a whole in terms of the interactions with Southeast Asia, and in particular investment in Scotland. Now we've got some view of our strengths, and it possibly doesn't match the view of our strengths from the view from the outside. I mean, I know from having been an expat, there's often a mismatch. We're good at food and drink, we're good at oil services. There are certain industries where we do export, but perhaps you could shed some light on where we could do more and what attributes people find appealing about it.
Well, certainly on my travels, I've come across people promoting Scotland, Scottish SDI, for example. in Beijing, and I'm sure it's still there. There was a Scottish attaché. There was one in Washington, and there was one that was established in Beijing. I myself don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing. I mean, I think it's good if you're promoting yourself, but perhaps if you're part of the bigger picture, it might pay off as well. That it shouldn't be one or the other. It should be both. I think one of your biggest exports has been Scotch whisky. I mean, I mentioned Korea, where we took it from nothing to I don't know what the figures are today, but if you look them up, they'd be very, very strong. Certainly in Thailand, I mean, one of the companies I was very close to chose to invest in Scotland. Thai Bev has 5 distilleries in Scotland, and some of the oldest malt distilleries as well, and that's been a very successful business for them. It's highlighting, I think, if you're looking for investment, it's a key to know, target what you're looking for and to bring it to their attention. I mean, one of the campaigns I came across, which I thought was very successful, was Great Scott, where people who've studied in Scotland or done business in Scotland, and then they go back to their home countries, but they actually meet on a regular basis, and they're used as sort of Scottish ambassadors overseas. I've no shortage of Scots that I've met on my travels. I mean, there's an awful lot of Scots who actually work as expats. There's a lot of Scots in the banking business, for example. But there's plenty of Scottish people out there promoting Scotland. I think really, and I've noticed, I mean, certainly from the Scottish government's perspective, they were very proactive in trying to raise interest in China. The Scottish First Minister and other ministers were there on a regular basis. But it's from my perspective, it is really identifying, well, what are you looking to target? What is it? And then put the tools in place to make that happen. But Scotland has never been, I would say, underrepresented, but it's something that I think it's not always been as successful as perhaps it would have liked to be. And there's a question now whether you're still looking for investors to come in, and if so, how are you going to go out there and cultivate them? And that's the key. I mean, it's not as easy as it sounds, but if you do look at the companies who are here at the moment, like Thai Bev, for example, if Thai Bev has come in here, well, are you looking for where would you get other Thai companies to come in, because they're beginning to invest outside of Thailand, and identify that. Many of them, I don't know, they've seemed to start buying football clubs in the UK. There's all sorts of Thai owners. They own Reading, they bought Sheffield Wednesday, they own Leicester. But it's this sort of thing that, I mean, it's sort of trying to get them interested. And I think trying to get them to come to Scotland in the first place. I mean, certainly one of my biggest pulls when I was in Korea, if I wanted someone senior Korean to come to the UK, if I could give him a round of golf at St Andrews, he'd be on the next plane. So you've got to find the means to get them to come, and then put a package around that to sort of keep them here. What you don't want is to get them just coming over to London. And my experience, certainly as far as China is concerned, is that while London may be the number one port of call, Edinburgh is where the Chinese wanted to come secondly. Most of their senior people would want to spend time in London, but their consulate here is probably as busy as their embassy in London, looking after VIPs, because they love coming here. So I don't think there's any difficulty in getting them to come, but you've got to have a very targeted plan on who do you want to come and what sectors do you want them to focus on.
Can I ask just briefly
Please.
about the other direction? One of the frustrations that's common across the UK is a sense that particularly a lot of SMEs could be much better at exporting or doing business internationally. And from your time working with UKTI in a range of posts, I mean, what do you see are the biggest sort of frustrations or the things that maybe hold smaller companies in particular from getting access to markets?
Well, what this is a personal view. I don't think it's necessarily shared by senior people in UKTI. But one of the most effective ways that we succeeded in South Korea was the Trade Mission Programme. Now, the Trade Mission Programme is subsidised to a degree, but it enabled SMEs to go out with a group. They could either go out in what we call a horizontal group, which is like a Chamber of Commerce group, or it could be a vertical group in a particular sector. But we got it up in Korea, we got it up to 25 missions in a year. And that got the SMEs into the market. They were allowed 3 visits, subsidized visits. It was on the basis that if you visited a market 3 times, that should be enough for you to decide whether you were going to do business there or not. But you were effectively subsidised the cost of an economy class fare. So it would get you there. There would be a very effective program waiting for you when you were there. You'd get target meetings with people while you were there. Now, what's happened in UKTI is the trade mission budget used to be probably the largest budget in UKTI. And as the government cuts came in, the easiest place to go when you've got cuts is to go to your biggest budget. Now, if you go to the trade mission budget and you cut it in half, it's still a relatively big budget compared to the rest. But gradually, you've seen a huge decline in the trade mission program. And I personally believe that's one of the biggest reasons why SMEs don't get out to the market as much as they used to. That used to be a means where you could. If you expect an SME to go out by himself, it's very, very difficult. They haven't got the resource, quite often they haven't got the budget, and they simply don't get out to these markets. And when they do, it's quite difficult if you go out by yourself, unless you've got a very good person on the ground or you've got help. So really, you put all those negatives together and you don't go out to the market. Whereas if you go out with let's say the Edinburgh Chamber of Commerce, and there's 20 of you on the mission in different fields, you get out, you have a briefing it's to Beijing, you have a briefing by the embassy on the Monday morning, they put on a reception for you in the evening, you get to meet a lot of people, you could have a tailored program if you want it putting in place. You have a pretty constructive week, and it could be that you go out and spend 3 days in Beijing and 2 days in Shanghai, very different markets, very different places. But you come back at the end of that week thinking, actually, I have a much better understanding of China than I had before. Now, remove the trade mission program, and it doesn't happen. And I think that's personally I think it was a mistake to reduce the trade mission program in the way it has, because it vast majority of the companies using the trade mission program are SMEs. The corporates didn't need to do it. So you take away the trade mission program, the people who suffer are the SMEs, and I think that's one of the components that's led to that.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
When thinking about the economic growth of Asia alongside the willingness of ASEAN nations to train together on the military front, and then contrasting that with some of the tensions between Taiwan and China, the political historical tensions between Japan and China, and also the land grab around the Spratly Islands for resources. What do you think will maintain the long-term security across Asia? Will it be political, military, or economic, which I think will play the main role?
I think what's changed quite a lot is actually that China is coming into becoming a superpower, and it's actually got to behave in the same way as a superpower does. They're already very strong economically, and they're continuing to be strengthened there. But if I give you an example, I mean, when I went to China in 2000, if the Japanese took some actions which the Chinese didn't like, they were very, very nervous about doing anything. I mean, if Japan were to do anything today, I can tell you they'd have the Chinese. There's no holding back anymore now. I mean, China will stand up to anybody. So their confidence has now come up, and they expect to be treated. They expect respect for that position. And if that respect is forthcoming, I think you'll find that China is a far easier country to deal with. And they've taken measures internally to try and tackle a number of issues, although people don't give them the credit that they're doing that. But I think if you handle the Chinese in the right way and you treat them with respect, you'll start seeing them being far more easier to deal with. What doesn't work with China and Asians in general is you telling them in public what they should do. Whatever you say they should do, they won't do as a matter of principle. So if you say they need to back down over something, I mean, it's the worst thing you could possibly do. So you just need to handle them in the right way and be respectful. And you'll see as time is passing, China is now looking for more ways to be seen to be why it has a right to be sitting at the top table. And I think if that respect is forthcoming, I think you'll see some of the tensions backing down. What is an issue, and is very difficult to resolve, is, as you talk about, well, Taiwan is not a small island, but some of these other islands are very small. Giving up land is incredibly emotional. If you give up the slightest bit of land, I mean, Thailand has this issue with Cambodia over a scrap of land. Nobody wants to give any land back, and again, if that's allowed to get out of hand, it can become very, very nasty very quickly, and there won't be any backing down. And I don't think you want to put China in that position. You want to try and keep them back, keep them talking from a diplomatic point of view, and you'll have less of this tension. But it's very difficult to handle, and it's something. I mean, I can remember being in the British Embassy in Beijing when a bomb landed on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and there was two journalists were killed. Well, the next day, outside the British embassy was an unauthorised mob who were pelting us with paint and ball bearings. And although they said this was purely spontaneous, it was their way of saying, well, we didn't like what you've done. So it's how you handle that. And I think the more you get to know them, the more you get to know the senior leadership, you develop those relations. That to my mind, is the way of trying to calm things down. I personally don't think China has any aspirations to become the master of the world, to take on other countries in the region. I mean, it has a huge military force, but I think their main issues are looking after the welfare of China. But these issues over land disputes are very difficult to resolve. There isn't an easy solution, unfortunately.
Kathy?
Yes, ma'am.
I just wondered how you find the transition from the Foreign Office to work.
It's if you're working in a government environment, it tends to be well controlled. There's a lot of rules and regulations and self-administration. And it's hard to get away from that. It's a sort of structure that you work in. In the private sector, I find that there's far less of that. There's a clear distinction. If you're adding value, basically you're left to get on and add value. I mean, people are not. They can see what you're doing. You are overseen to a degree, but it's fairly tenuous. You're reporting on what you're doing, but people can see that you're actually making a positive contribution and you're adding value. And really, while you're doing that, then continue to do it. The same token, if you're seen to be not adding value, you won't stay around for very long, because there's no room for anybody who's not pulling their weight. So my preference is very much on the private sector side, because you're allowed to get on, and if you can see initiatives that you want to take, you don't have so many hurdles to go over to get these agreed, if they're going to be agreed. Whereas on the government side, it's very difficult to get away from that. And unfortunately, what seems to be happening more and more on the government side is that certain departments' budgets are continuously under threat. And while they're under threat, the most expensive thing is your resource, so your actually manpower resource. So you can't afford to have so many people. Your conditions of service start being eroded. I'm not saying that diplomats live in palaces, but you're expected to have far smaller accommodation. You're not given an entertainment allowance to entertain. We're actually, for a diplomat, entertainment is probably one of their main ways of cultivating contacts. But if that's actually narrowed down, your package as a whole becomes far less attractive. And not only does it become less attractive, but you find it far harder to operate. And I find on the private sector side, certainly with OCS, none of those constraints are there. I mean, I don't get given a limitless entertainment allowance, but basically none of my entertainment's ever been questioned. It's basically, it's there. You explain what it's for. There's a clear purpose, and basically, little things which used to irritate me. It was if under the government system, if you were travelling for a few days on a trip, you weren't allowed to have your shirt laundered, or which I mean, the one thing is, if you're representing your company, you want to make sure that you're well turned out and you're not in a crumpled shirt or looking haggard for the sake of relatively small expenditure. Well, I don't find any of that on the private sector side, but it's a judgment that you take. It's open to scrutiny, but I say I've never had any issues, and I find it much easier operating in the private sector.
We've got time just for one last question before we finish up. Is there anyone? James?
We hear a lot about China and India, and it's great to hear you talking about Thailand. In your opinion, are there any areas of Asia that perhaps UK and Scotland are not investing into the level that perhaps other European or Western countries are?
I think most markets, unfortunately, if you go around China and go around the various industrial parks, the likelihood is you'll find a German company there. Very few British companies. Most cities, or the major cities, if you go to Beijing, there's the Lufthansa Center. There's, they're making a positive statement. We haven't done it in the same way, and I think perception is a huge thing. I mean, if you take probably our strongest suit in Asia, and one I think wherever I've been, there's been no denying this. One of our strongest suits is our education system. Now, China's just changing its policy from a one-child policy, but within China, they want to give the very best education to their children, and they would see the UK as being the place to offer that. And I haven't been anywhere else where that isn't the case. But I think for the UK, including Scotland, for us to prosper, we have to be very targeted on playing to our strengths and really not going across the board, but playing to our strengths and going about it in the right way. And above all, I think you have to demonstrate to the markets that you're serious about it. If you don't go there and you don't go there on a regular basis, and your competitors do, unfortunately, they're going to come to the conclusion that they take it more seriously than you do. It's not difficult, and it's little things like that. They do play a huge part in how successful you are. I think you won't find any shortage of support on the official side. I think if you look from the different embassies and high commissions and consulates, if anything, in the main markets, they've been beefed up quite considerably. China still expanding, India is expanding. I make a point, most of the markets I go in, to go and see the embassy. It's a very good source of intelligence for me, and a huge assistance. But sadly, I get the general feeling that business are not using those resources as much as they used to, and I think that's a mistake. The teams on the ground, particularly as was mentioned earlier on, the local staff. In Thailand, I had 2 members of my staff who'd been working for us for over 30 years. I mean, they knew their sectors backwards. They knew all the right people. If you were operating those sectors and came along, and I put you in front of them for half an hour, you'd be fixed. And by and large, in all of the embassies, high commissions, these teams of people are there. And I think by not using them, companies are doing themselves a disservice. From my own perspective, if our competitors are not using them the same way as we are, we're not unhappy about that whatsoever.
Is that because companies are now going online for the same sort of perceived same level of data, whereas perhaps go locally they get much deeper?
I think in all of these markets, you need to know them well. If you don't, you'll come a cropper somewhere down the line. Now, part and parcel of that process should be going to the embassies and the high commissions and the consulates, because they're only too happy to help you. But I think the important thing is just that they know that you're there, that you're looking to do business. If you keep in regular touch with them, if they give you some advice and some help and some contacts, give them some feedback. Let them know that was excellent. We did very well with that. Have you got anybody else you could help us with? And what's becoming more the pattern, and it happens in China, India, and in Southeast Asia, you're getting, in the case of Southeast Asia, regional leads. So there's one person, for example, on education, looks after education based in Kuala Lumpur. The healthcare lead is in Singapore. In India, you'll find there's one person, the person in Bangalore might take the lead on manufacturing. In China, it might be the person in Shanghai who leads. Now, if you narrow that down, and then if any of those markets are of interest to you, you focus in on the person where the lead is, you're not just getting the information on that particular place, you're getting the whole region. So they might be saying to you at the moment, Malaysia's not the place to be, but actually Myanmar is exactly where you should be. But you're getting that steer, and I think that's invaluable, and it's something that's so easy to get, but so few people are taking advantage of.
That's excellent, thank you. Just a comment there about the value of personal contacts and speaking to the right people and getting to know them. To which end, I hope that you'll stick around. I disturbingly haven't heard the clink of wine bottles, but I do hope that they're out there, just out in the reception. Thanks again, Steve, very much.
Very welcome.
Great talk, and I do hope you'll stick around if you fancy a chat with Steve and anyone else who's in the room.
Thank you very much. No, thank you. Thank you.